This sermon is based on Matthew 17, verses 1 to 9, and 2 Peter 1, 16 to the end. Over 20 years ago, I heard a prophetic word about this church. We're just moving to Maisons-Laffitte, and this word from God that somebody told me was really exciting about how God was going to do amazing things in our midst. And it was beautiful, it was exciting, and I wanted to see what would happen. But over the years, it just seemed that life carried on in the church. If I'm honest, I didn't see much change. In fact, sometimes things felt harder than they had been before. There were moments of conflict. There were long interregnums. There was COVID. At one point, Sunday school just shrank down to just a handful of kids. And there are times in that journey, I'll be honest, I wondered, was all that stuff just made up? Was that promise true? Is God really doing stuff here at Holy Trinity? Should I be expecting much at this point? And I wonder if slightly I was starting to lose hope about what God wanted to do here in Maisons-Laffitte. And that raises a broader question. What do you do when the promise you've been living on doesn't seem to be working? That's where the disciples find themselves in today's passage. And it's also where Peter's readers find themselves in the epistle. And I wonder if that's where some of us are today. You see, we all base our lives on promises. We all look for things to stand on to make us feel secure and firm ground that we can rely on. Now, as a Christian believer, you might rely on your faith for reassurance and clarity and stability. Those of you who are non-believers might look to work, relationships, projects, money. And wherever we are, we kind of create these little promises that we try to stand on. Things like, if I just work hard enough, I'll feel secure. Or, I just need to be a decent person and then life will be fair. Or, if I believe the right things, God will make it make more sense. Perhaps it's, I just need to find Mr. Right or Miss Right to be happy. Or, if my kids are happy, I'll be happy. Or, if I follow Jesus, I won't feel so disorientated. Let me ask, what's the promise that's actually organising your life right now? What are you standing on? And then, what's more, what happens when these promises don't seem to hold us? What happens when, despite our little well-planned life and what we think is true and what we think is going to happen, what happens when the diagnosis comes? What happens when our child walks away from faith, or our career stalls, or our prayer feels like it hits the ceiling, or the future looks smaller than it used to? What happens when we start to question the promises our life have been built on? Well, we're not the first to discover that our expectations of how life works can fracture. The disciples felt this too. They believed in the Messiah, the glorious Messiah that would come, that would overthrow the Romans, that would usher in the kingdom and would restore justice in a blaze of glory. But at the beginning of this passage, you might have heard it at the very start. 6 days later. Well, the question is, what happened 6 days earlier? Right? In fact, 6 days earlier, what happened was Jesus was explaining to his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem to suffer, to die, and then to rise up in glory. And Peter rejected this. He said, far be it, Lord, this could never happen to you. Jesus had to reprimand him, get behind me, Satan, all of that passage. And then Jesus says, look, you have to take up your cross and follow me. Deny yourself, lose your life to find it. This is not the story of the Messiah that they were hoping for. This is not the promise they had signed up to. Losing your life, suffering, dying. What's this all about? How can this be the path to life? And then we have Peter, who many years later is writing his letter, right, to this church. And the context of 2 Peter is really that there are scoffers, people who are kind of laughing at the church, saying, look, you thought Jesus was coming, but there's been decades that have passed since that happened, and nothing changes, life still goes on. And his readers, that early church, might have been thinking, you know what? Are these promises, the promises that we stand on, suddenly a bit empty? Can we still trust those? I wonder what the promises are, which you're wondering, can I still trust those? Well, when that happens, when those questions come, we look for a coping strategy. And I want to describe that coping strategy as this. We build shelters. As believers, we perhaps start to avoid the bits of the Bible that unsettle us, challenge us too much. We tame it all down, make it more manageable, dilute some of those promises that feel a bit extravagant. We shrink our discipleship down. We shrink what we believe we need to be doing to something manageable. Oh, surely God doesn't want us to, let's say, keep sex for marriage or spread the message actively in this secular, atheistic country that we seem to live in. Or whatever else it is, where you feel tempted to dilute the message. Or perhaps we fill our diaries with noise, with action, with so many things, so we don't have to face the deeper questions and re-establish our foundations. Ultimately, we want our faith to deliver glory. Christianity can easily become, go to great services, go to great prayer meetings, sing the great songs, stay in that world of glory. That feels good, right? Well, this is the disciples' temptation, to build a shelter on the mountain. That's exactly what Peter suggests when he's there and Jesus starts to radiate his glory. Freeze that moment. It's kind of like Peter's saying, right? Keep this shining Jesus. Let's stay here. This is amazing. Let's avoid that hard road that you just talked about, Jesus. Let's avoid the road to the cross and let's stay here in the glory. And whether we believe it or not, the instinct is the same for either of us. Make life smaller so it feels comfortable. Build our little shelter so we feel safe. For non-believers, it might look a bit different. It might look more like, wow, let's just assume nothing's coming. History is simply going to roll on as it always does. So let's just lower our hopes to what is controllable, what seems reasonable. And this is really the scoffer's temptation, the temptation that we see in 2 Peter. Right? And I describe that as really building an emotional shelter. Lower the stakes, lower your expectations, assume it's all down to you, assume nothing is coming. So do you see that the disciples' temptation of building the shelter on the mountain and the scoffer's temptation of building this emotional shelter are kind of similar? Because what happens is that when promises stop sustaining us, when we feel we can't build our life on them anymore, we don't stand still. We shrink. We build a shelter. We downshift. We choose smaller hopes, safer lives, and lower stakes. It looks sensible, but doesn't it drain us? So again, let me ask, what's the promise that you're actually basing your life on right now? And is it making you braver or smaller? Are you playing bigger or playing safe because of that promise? Now, what happens on the mountain? Well, God does something unexpected. You see, first of all, why did they even go on the mountain, right? It wasn't their initiative. They didn't hold a prayer vigil to decide what they were going to do with their lives faced with Jesus' challenging teaching. They weren't looking for a solution. They weren't looking for an experience. They were just kind of heads down and just muddle through. But Jesus intervenes. He takes them up a mountain, away from usefulness, away from productivity, away from busyness, and away from control. There's no coping, there's no distractions. You're just there on the mountain. He intervenes. Perhaps he's intervening with you too, right now. And then he interrupts. He interrupts Peter mid-sentence. Just as he's talking about building a shelter, he interrupts. Perhaps he needs to interrupt you too. God does not negotiate with our coping strategies. He doesn't offer a set of virtues. He doesn't offer a set of Christian values. He doesn't offer us wise thoughts. He doesn't offer us clear proof. What does he do on that mountaintop? He points to a person. He points to Jesus and he says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to him when he says he must suffer, die, rise and reign. Listen to him when he says that denying yourself is the path to life." And those many decades later, when Peter's writing his letter, he doesn't defend the faith against these scoffers. He doesn't defend it with theories. But he defends it with witness. He says, we heard that voice ourselves. We saw his glory. God doesn't answer our anxieties. He recenters us on Jesus, everything on Jesus. So perhaps the promises you've been living on are not the voice of God. What's the strategy you've been using to cope with life right now? Is it the voice of Jesus? Or is it just a coping strategy that God's want to interrupt and intervene with? Perhaps it's time to listen to Jesus again. You see, that's the promise that we get to build our life on. Jesus, the one who's glorified on the mountaintop and then is glorified again. It's the language the Bible uses, glorified again on the cross, where he dies for us. He restores us to God and breaks open the way back for us, sinful people, to go back into the relationship with God that we're destined for. Do you see, the one who speaks of loss and suffering on the cross is shining with glory on that mountain and now in the Father's side. You see, the future of the world is not a principle. It's not respecting Christian values. It's not the power of the church. It's the person of Jesus who passes through death and comes out the other side. And that is why obeying Jesus is not foolish. Your sacrifices in the name of Jesus are not wasted. Waiting for God's promises is not pointless. Faithfulness is not naive. And that's why Peter is unshakable those decades later in the face of the scoffers. The future he hopes for is the one he has already glimpsed. And that's why he urges us in the letter. Did you see the text? It's a beautiful text. You will do well to be attentive to this, as to a lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. So when we're in the dark place, let's be attentive to that lamp that's shining, the person of Jesus, the revelation of Jesus. That's the call, to live by that light. So where do we go from here? Well, Jesus says one thing to the disciples, and he says it to us. He says at the end, get up and do not be afraid. He leads them down the mountain. See, that's his invitation and that's his command to us. Get up and don't be afraid. Stop settling for the promises that are shrinking you. Pay attention to Jesus, his words, his being, his promise. Let him interrupt how you decide, hope, and act this coming week. Perhaps that's going to look like forgiving someone you'd rather avoid, staying faithful in a calling that no longer feels exciting, giving when you'd rather hoard, speaking truth when silence is safer, or trusting him when clarity is absent. When you're tempted to downshift into safety, pause and ask, what has Jesus already said about this? When anxiety spikes, instead of scrolling on your phone or going numb, perhaps sit in silence for 2 minutes and say, "Speak, Lord, I'm listening." Or when you feel the urge to freeze a safe version of your faith and stop growing, ask, am I building a shelter or following him down the mountain? Go back to the story that I mentioned at the start. When I look back at those years in the church, the most important thing wasn't that things eventually began to move again. Honestly, the things we've seen over the last couple of years have been so exciting and inspiring to me. But the most important thing was not that part. It was staying faithful when it felt to me, with my limited perspective, I didn't see anything happening. It was staying faithful even when there was a temptation to build a smaller version of the story and to give up. You see, the disciples still had to walk down that mountain back into the confusion of their lives and the messiness of following Jesus. Peter still had to write to a church facing delay and no easy answers, but experiencing the majesty, the glory, that radiance of Jesus made all the difference. And for us, well, we still live in a world where not everything changes overnight. So when the promises you've been living on stop working, when you're tempted to give up, doubt the promises of God, don't shrink the story. Don't build a shelter. Get up. Don't be afraid. He is the beloved Son of the Lord God our Father. Listen to him.